Jonathan Turley, in your book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, you write, I happen to like modern art. However, when it comes to constitutional law, I am unapologetically Rockwellian. Once free speech becomes more of an abstraction, it can be balanced against other interests and confined to achieve other goals. It is more Rothko than Rockwell, leaving greater room for the interpreter. That is a dangerous practice when applied to the interpretation of a constitutional right. Explain.
Well, you know, the book talks about actually two paintings by Rockwell as an example of this idea of interpretation and how we often have these connoisseurs, not just in art, but in constitutional law, that position themselves as intermediaries to explain language that seems very clear to American citizens. It is, and the reason I talk about Rockwell is that Rockwell was a fascinating artist because he could paint in a great variety of genres and paint quite well. He went to the best art schools in the world. But he developed his own genre, and there was one interview that really struck me where he said, you know, I went through the United States and I saw things that were incredibly profound, little things, vignettes, scenes, that struck me as being so profound that they were being missed by my contemporaries. And he said, I wanted to paint that. And he did, you know, when he painted a police officer having ice cream with a kid at a counter. It really wasn't just that. When you had an umpire screaming at a player and a manager, it wasn't just that moment. It was what the moment represented about a people. And Rockwell wanted to paint it. And when it came to free speech, he told the White House that he wanted to paint the freedoms that FDR had talked about as we moved towards World War II. And the first one he painted was free speech. And I think many people in the White House were sort of like, what's this? Because it was this image of this singular guy standing up in a meeting. And they sort of expected George Washington crossing the Delaware or something to put on a war bonds poster. And they said, you know, what's this? And Rockwell said, that's my neighbor. That's Jim Edgerton. And what he explained was that he went to a meeting in Vermont and they were debating building a new school and everyone was in favor of it. And then one person stood up, this person, and said, how are we going to pay for it? This was actually, Jim Edgerton was actually the great-great-grandson of a revolutionary hero, but he was now just a small dairy farmer. And he said, you know, I have a dairy farm and I'm going to lose it, like many of the people in this room. We can't make it to the end of the year. How are we going to pay for this? Because I don't want to lose my farm. Rockwell was so struck by this moment because, of course, it's more difficult to use free speech often with people who are your friends than with people who are your enemies. He painted that. But what was interesting is that it did become the war bonds poster, and Americans got it immediately. They understood. It was a strange poster for its time. It didn't have any violent imagery, any battleship. It was this one guy. But Americans understood that's who we are. That's what we're fighting for. It's that essence that doesn't need interpretation. It's not simplistic, as some of his critics suggested. It's incredibly profound. And I feel the same way about the First Amendment. I sort of agree with Hugo Black, who said, I believe that no law bridging means no law bridging. It's a very clear amendment. But what the book talks about is that the First Amendment and what it said about free speech was the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution. People have no idea how revolutionary that language is and still is. Many of our rights, many of our traditions come from Great Britain. The framers liked the legal system in Great Britain. They just didn't like the governing system. The one thing that was a huge departure, where there was no precedent, was the protection of free speech. The British did not protect free speech, and they still don't, in my view. The free press is another example of that. But it seemed to just come out of the head of Zeus to have this type of language. And people today still find it revolutionary. I have a colleague who has called for amending the First Amendment and says that it's aggressively individualistic. There are other law professors who are saying we should trash the Constitution. There are books out that says that free speech and the First Amendment, according to one Michigan law professor, is the Achilles heel of the United States. So there is this still ongoing debate over what is so revolutionary about that language. And the book tries to answer why it is we're still struggling with free speech.
And now, before we get too far from that first quote we put up, what's the Mark Rothko connection to free speech?
Well, the point is that law professors tend to be connoisseurs, like the ones I discuss in the history of Rockwell. And for them, the First Amendment, while many of us view it as clear and robust, they view it as more nuanced. They suggest it can't mean just that. It has to be something more complex, something that we will explain to you, that there's trade-offs to be made, there's balancings to be had. It's more of a Rothko. It's more of an abstraction that we place within contemporary times. That's not my view, and that's why I am admittedly quite Rockwellian when it comes to free speech.
You write that the human brain is hardwired for free expression.
Yes, and the book is a little quirky because it goes into not just art but scientific and medical studies. It tries to answer what is free speech, and to answer that question, you really have to understand what is being human all about. I think part of the problem, the reason we struggle with free speech, is we tend to only consider it when we have insular little conflicts, is free speech good here in this circumstance? There's much more there. And what the book suggests is that free speech is a natural right, that it's a right that the framers believed was given to human beings by God. It's something that makes you completely human. But there's other aspects that suggest that it is a human right. Studies have shown that if we don't use free speech, expression, creativity, we physically change. There's parts of our brain that change. Studies of prisoners in segregation and explorers that have been cut off from the world. Things like the hippocampus actually shrink when they don't use it. We are hardwired in that sense. And what the book asks is, before we figure out what free speech is, let's try to figure out what being human is and why we need it. And you can look at being human in so many ways. You can look at DNA, right? But that doesn't help you much in the sense that we have roughly a 98% overlap with great apes in DNA. We have an over 60% overlap with a fruit fly. Okay? We have a roughly 60% overlap with a banana. Now, does that make us a talking banana? Or is there something else that is quintessentially human? And what the book suggests is, it is in fact the fact that we are a creative species, that we need to be able to project part of ourselves in the world around us. And that's captured all around us. It's captured from everything from doodling, which everyone does, to the Great Wall of China. It's captured in a starving artist. When Van Gogh was literally starving, someone gave him money to eat. And what did he do? He went out and bought more canvas and paint. Now, survival is considered the most basic of human instincts, but here you have an individual who's starving, and the minute he gets money, he goes out and buys more paint and canvas. So the point of the book is, before we define free speech, we have to understand this human impulse and why this is a human right. Once you do that, it changes the dynamic. It doesn't allow as many trade-offs as we often see in the courts, if it is a human right. And so the book challenges people to try to make their own decision on this. But if they believe that free speech is a human right, then it will change the dynamic of these questions that the book then turns to.
Professor Turley, in a political sense, where did the concept of free speech develop and how?
Well, the book traces back free speech back to ancient Athens, and it was fascinating because they had two different terms for free speech in Athens. One was free speech in the agora, in the marketplace, which we can call sort of political speech, where you're speaking publicly, and one which was free speech privately. And so early on, you had this distinction between types of speech based on their function. And one of the things that the book argues against is what I call functionalism, which is the alternative to the view I'm pushing in the book, which is the natural rights view or the personal autonomy view or human rights view. And functionalism, you'll recognize from a lot of different opinions. It's when courts say, we protect free speech because we need it for democracy. It's good for democracy. And that is certainly true. It's just more than that. But the whole marketplace of ideas and all of those concepts are based on this functionalist idea that we support free speech because we need it, right, for these other rights. But the problem with that is that it allows you to do trade-offs. It means that you could say some speech is not so good for democracy. Some speech is bad speech, and we can choose between good and bad speech. We can protect speech in different ways. It's easier to do that with a functionalist view of free speech.
What about the Enlightenment? What was its role in free speech?
Well, I talk about how the Enlightenment affected the framers, and particularly Lockean theory. So John Locke, when he described the sort of creation of society in his two treatises, he talks about the state of nature. But there's a curious thing about the state of nature with Locke, and that is, unlike philosophers like Hobbes that viewed the state of nature as the sort of brutal, violent place, Locke believed that human beings were sort of fully formed when it came to rights. He believed they had rights, including rights to property. He believed that God created everything in common, and then with our labor, we would mix our labor with things and make it our own. But those things then adhere to us as a divine gift, something that God gave humanity. So Locke did not believe that rights were created with the creation of the state. Rather, the state was there to help protect those essential rights of human beings. That appealed to the framers in a very fundamental way. In all of their writings, you see them talk about, including in the Declaration of Independence, these gifts of God, these inalienable rights. When you say it's inalienable, they're not talking about we just created it so you can't lose it. They're talking about we are breaking from Britain because you have denied something that belongs to us as human beings. Free speech was one of those rights that they held closest. And we had that moment of clarity at the beginning of the Republic, and it was lost. It was lost during the Adams administration, where John Adams became everything he fought against in the Revolution. You know, he prosecuted his opponents under the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson was better. He pardoned everybody who was convicted under Adams, but after all, those were all Jeffersonians. And then he prosecuted people for sedition. And so we lost that moment of clarity. We sort of had a default back to the British system, back to Blackstonian or functionalist theories of free speech. And we have found ourselves on that slippery slope ever since.
What is sedition, and what's its connection to the concept of free speech?
Well, the book talks a lot about sedition and what I refer to as breaking our sedition addiction, because in 1800, James Madison wrote a wonderful essay where he talks about the sedition prosecutions that were going on and the ones that had already occurred under Adams. And in the middle of this essay, he used an interesting term. He referred to it as a monster. And when I first read it, I kept reading that line over and over again, because he's right. It is a monster. It sort of lives within us, within the body politic. We release it every time we are really angry or we're really afraid. We release it on our neighbors. That's why the book's subtitle is Free Speech in an Age of Rage, because this isn't our first. This country was born in rage. That was the Boston Tea Party. And in those moments, we release this monster on our neighbors. But sedition goes back to Great Britain when the king wanted to prosecute his critics for treason. And even though the British courts were very enabling of the British monarchy, they gave the monarchy most of what it wanted, it couldn't make this work. So the British judges started to say, look, we cannot say that giving a bawdy joke about the Queen in a pub is treason because we can't fit the elements. So what the Crown did is they created a sort of treason light They created sedition. And then they created a special forum, which became a speech prosecution forum. And most people know of it. It's called the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber was originally a speech prosecution forum, and it was handling these sedition cases. So when the United States was formed, many people like Madison believed that we would reject sedition, but we didn't. It was this addiction we could not break. And we've had sedition-related prosecutions throughout our history, not as many, but even after January 6th, we had a handful of cases involving sedition. One thing the book talks about is we can eliminate sedition from the criminal code. We can do what James Madison asked us to do, and it wouldn't make any difference at all. That is, the funny thing about these sedition prosecutions, even the ones recently with January 6th, they're completely superfluous. People are prosecuted under an assortment of different laws that have concurrent sentencing, but they add a sedition charge for the same reason that John Adams did it, because it has this speech sort of stigma. It punishes you for having dangerous thoughts as opposed to what you did. And that's what this book argues, is that we have to focus on conduct, not content, when we prosecute these cases.
James Madison, though, was he always a free speech advocate?
Well, Madison had some writings that seem to go a little in different ways. He does refer to free speech in sort of Lockean terms in his writings, but many of them, people don't realize how revolutionary this was, both free speech and free press, because there were no sort of pre-existing rights for them to base it on. In England, free speech was not protected, and free press was largely a fight over permitting and licensing. That is, most of those fights were over having to get a royal license to bring a book in. So you had very famous cases in which they refused to get that stamp and they were prosecuted. What's fascinating about the First Amendment is it is completely new. I mean, there are actually Enlightenment writers that talk about natural rights, and so it's not new in that sense. But it's new in terms of a government, like a constitution or a law. And it is stated in these absolute terms. And I think the reason they do that is because they wanted this revolution to be about the Enlightenment. They wanted it to be about individual rights, human rights. And when they thought about what is the essential human rights, free speech was, and the right to free religious expression were right up there.
So the Speaker's Corner in London, is that connected to the sedition, treason light?
Well, it is funny because the British have always relied on a benign monarchy. And it affects many of their laws. When I used to represent, for a while I represented the House of Representatives at some litigation. And when I went over, I was asked to participate in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And I was asked by the lawyers of the House of Commons and House of Lords to come and sort of talk about the differences between the countries, particularly in the legislative branch. And I joked afterwards, it went much longer, about 3 times longer than any of us anticipated. It was one of those wonderful English teas, which are irreplaceable. But we went on about 3 times longer, and at the end of which I said, I can honestly say I understand you less now than I did when I came. And partially it's because everything they said went against the grain for an American scholar, in that they rely on this sort of beneficence, this benign motive that, even on appropriations, they sort of work with ministries, and ministries go ahead and do what they need to do and come back and talk to them about it. When it comes to free speech, it's very much like that. They don't have protections for free speech. They rely on what is truly a good tradition. That has come back to haunt them because free speech isn't a free fall in the United Kingdom. It is one of the sort of red light countries for the free speech community. Those free speech groups are really on the ropes. I mean, I've talked to many of them. And they're prosecuting people for a wide array of what we would consider protected political speech.
Isn't there a case in England where a woman was praying outside an abortion clinic and was arrested for silently praying?
Yes, and the officers came up to her and said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Praying," and they said, "Well, that's illegal because you're near an abortion clinic," and many people said, "Wow, that's a thought crime," but they have other cases like that. They had one guy who was a truly grotesque individual who lived with his mom and basically stayed in his room, but his room was like a hate fest. It was like every hateful group this guy was grooving on in his room, from the KKK to the Nazis. And he was prosecuted, but he was prosecuted for his possession of discriminatory, hateful literature. And the judge said, "You are being prosecuted for your hateful ideology," and what the judge called a toxic ideology. Well, that is indeed a thought crime. And it shows how once you're on the slippery slope, how there is no place to get footing. And you end up like this judge, who had no problem saying, "You're being sent to jail for toxic ideologies, thoughts in your head that we find unacceptable."
But if that's the case in England and in Germany, we can talk about as well, isn't that approach supported by the population? The restriction of free speech?
It is, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important to decide what free speech is. If it's a human right, it doesn't matter that the majority want to destroy it. And this is an argument made by many Europeans, that this is what our public wants. We wouldn't feel that way about other rights, presumably. The United States Constitution is actually a counter-majoritarian document. It's there to protect people in the minority, because you don't need protection if you're in the majority, right? You can just have direct democracy. That's what Athens tried. You know, everyone celebrates the democracy of Athens, which really lasted only a blink in comparison to the history of governments. It fell apart. It became a tyranny because it was unstable. And the framers talked about Athens a great deal because they didn't want it. They didn't want what they viewed as democratic despotism. They didn't want a tyranny of the majority. Free speech is an example of that. The fact that everyone wants to silence minorities is nothing new, right? That's why we need a First Amendment.
Part of the First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." Has that held over the past 250 years?
No, it hasn't. And, you know, this book promises an unvarnished history of free speech in America. And our advertising is not quite as good as our record. We've arrested through the ages people by the thousands, unionists, feminists, fascists. We arrested them all. And it came in times of rage. It came when we were very afraid or we were very angry, and we released that monster that Madison talked about. And then we cycle out of it, and we sort of get our senses about us. But that is our history. And this book talks about the periods and personalities that framed our understanding of free speech. And the people who I think are the real heroes, and they're not the John Adams. They're not even the Thomas Jeffersons. They're people like Charlotte Anita Whitney. You know, the book's title, the Indispensable Right, comes from a concurring opinion by one of the great civil libertarians, maybe the most brilliant person ever to sit on the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis wrote beautifully of that this right is indispensable because all other rights depend on free speech. And it's an amazing passage. But then you have to remind yourself he was concurring to the upholding of the conviction of Whitney. And so Whitney was a communist. She was an extraordinarily brave woman. She came from, she traced her lineage to multiple families on the Mayflower. I'm not quite sure how. I guess the inbreeding in the United States is real, but at least for the founding families. But she was the niece of Justice Field, who was one of the longest standing justices on the Supreme Court, would spend summers with him. She went to Wellesley with a lot of other privileged women. And they went for a field trip to a settlement in New York. And they were supposed to spend just a few days there. She spent months. And what she saw for the first time was poverty and suffering that she never imagined. And to her credit, she wanted to do something about it. I disagree with her becoming a communist. I think she was wrong about that. But she was right why she did it. She wanted to stop the suffering, and she wanted to do something about it. And she ultimately went to California and fought for the right for women to vote. And she also fought against lynchings. And a day came when she was about to give one of these speeches. She was a very talented speaker. And the police came up to her in California and said, if you give another anti-lynching speech, we will arrest you. And to bring that point home, they put a police officer right behind her on the stage. And this woman of privilege went up on that stage, and she gave exactly that speech. It was an amazingly courageous moment, and they arrested her. And it made it all the way to the Supreme Court with Brandeis and Holmes sitting on the court, and they agreed with her conviction. And so one of the reasons I use that title is to try to get people to think, here you have these great minds, particularly Louis Brandeis, talking about the indispensability of free speech, making it totally dispensable. And the question is why? How could these people lose their way so significantly?
And why did Brandeis concur with the conviction?
I think it is because of the hold of functionalism. I think that he viewed free speech in a functional sense, that it was key for democracy, but that meant that there could be trade-offs. Some things are bad for democracy. Some things have to be controlled. And that is the siren's call that has been used for centuries to corrupt the best of minds, including Brandeis. Instead of viewing this as a human right, instead of saying what Whitney was doing was essential to her, not just to democracy, to her. And that's part of the problem with being a free speech advocate, is that you often, I agree with what Whitney was saying, but you often have to defend people you don't agree with. People like, Brandenburg, who became the subject of a later famous case, that actually added protections to free speech. But Brandenburg was himself a horrible human being. I mean, he hated Jews, Catholics, immigrants. He hated everyone except Brandenburg. And no one would claim that what Brandenburg had to say is of any value at all to anyone. But it had value to him. And the point about a human right is that he is allowed to project even the most grotesque image around him. And then we have a right to respond and to argue how grotesque that is.
Jonathan Turley, you mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes. We all, I think, know about yelling fire in a crowded theater. One of his famous lines, is that free speech?
Well, it's funny because I have a long chapter on Oliver Wendell Holmes, and my editors kept on calling me and saying, do we really need a whole chapter on Oliver Wendell Holmes? I said, how crazy? Of course we do. The question is, do we need a whole book on Oliver Wendell Holmes? The reason that I took time to talk about Oliver Wendell Holmes is not just because you're right. That line is a mantra for the anti-free speech movement. But what I say in the book is if you want to know how we lost our way as a country on free speech, you need to know how Oliver Wendell Holmes lost his way. Now, this was one of the most brilliant individuals ever to grace the court. He was blazingly bright. He was blazingly courageous. He served in the Civil War, was repeatedly wounded. His father actually saved him from one of those wounds. He was given up for dead. His father taught medicine at Harvard. And there was tension between senior and junior. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. always seemed to be irritated by his father. His father was more of a free spirit. In fact, when you look at the two of them, I came away liking Senior more than Junior, even though I respect the justice. His father is irresistible. He just wanted to be a poet, and he was a damn good one. In fact, many people consider him one of the best American poets of his generation. to the point that at one time his father went out and sawed the MD off the sign in front of his house. And Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. clearly did not like that aspect. Like Oliver Wendell Holmes, the justice, was a bit of a tied down guy. You know, his father, for his time, was almost bohemian, you know, for what he was doing. But it was his father who went to a battlefield and retrieved his son and nursed him back. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes went back and was wounded again. He was the most unlucky soldier in the history of warfare. Every time he walked onto a battlefield, someone shot him. And he didn't seem to get the hint that maybe he needs a desk job. But what I was really interested in was that I've taught free speech for a long time, and I've taught subjects with Holmes for a long time. And one of the things that always struck me when I was teaching some of his writings was he was different from other positivists. That positivists are people who believe that the legitimacy of law is how it's enacted, right? So it's not natural law, it's not natural rights. It's the fact that a democratic system produces those laws. And he was one of the leading positivists, but there was a difference. When Oliver Wendell Holmes talks about natural rights, there's a vehemence, almost an anger about him that I never understood. And so I spent a lot of time trying to walk back where he developed this. And I found that it started to develop while he was at Harvard. He probably was an atheist as a student at Harvard, but I think it was then magnified on the fields of the Civil War. You know, when I looked at the contents of his kit, one time he was wounded, they listed the contents of his kit, his baggage. And among the books that he took to the battlefield was Hobbes' Leviathan. And I write in the book, of all the books that I would not want young Holmes to take to the Civil War, it would be the Leviathan. Because I'm sure he read that and looked around him at that carnage and said, yeah, you know, the natural world, the natural resting place of human beings is violent and brutish. And the carnage is unstoppable until we create a government, and a powerful central government at that. He came away with this view, and it was his undoing in my view. It's how you end up with opinions like Buck v. Bell, where he signed off on the sterilization of a woman who was viewed as mentally incompetent, which she wasn't, by the way. But what's shocking about Buck v. Bell is his mocking language. That he just dismisses this woman who was the first woman sterilized under that law. That's part of, I think, the fact that he was untethered. He did not believe there were any transcendental rights, things that frame us in those moments. When it came to free speech, all of that came out. And ultimately, he did write the opinion in Schenck that
this is Charles Schenck.
Yes, a socialist, and he was prosecuted for just passing around literature that would be clearly protected today. And when Holmes got the opinion, he dismissed his free speech interests and used his famous line about crying fire in a crowded theater. Actually, that was a lift. He actually took it from an earlier case in a brief, so actually it was not his own work. He changed it slightly. But it became the mantra for everyone who wanted to limit free speech. It is, in fact, one of the most unfortunate lines ever uttered by a justice. If I could go back in history, I probably would go back to that moment as he's writing that line and take the pen out of his hand and say, think again. Even Holmes ultimately, I think, regretted it because it's the danger of a soundbite. It overwhelmed analysis for everyone. It became the easy rationalization to silence neighbors. You just say, oh, it's like you're crying fire in a crowded theater. Well, today that line is heard over and over again. You know, when I've testified a lot on free speech in Congress, and before Musk took over X, I testified in the House Judiciary Committee, and almost all the Democratic members said, you have no proof of coordination of the government and social media organizations. And I said, I actually do. It's actually in my testimony, but I admit it's not complete because Twitter, Facebook, have refused to turn over their files. They refuse to be transparent. But we have every indication of that coordination. It's very clear that it's being coordinated. Then Musk bought Twitter, and he released the files. And I was called to testify not long after that in front of the same members at the House Judiciary Committee. And it changed dramatically. The members were no longer denying that there was coordination. Now they were saying, of course there's coordination. And one of the members, Dan Goldman from New York, said, you know, Professor, you know as well as I do, you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. And of course, my hair catches on fire every time that line is delivered. And I said, you know, Congressman, just as a footnote, you do realize you're quoting a line from Schenck of a socialist who was convicted for passing out a flyer that quoted the United States Constitution to oppose the draft. Is that the case? Is that the standard you want to replicate? Is that the authority you think we should control? And Goldman said, we don't need a law lecture. And I suggested, I think you do, right? I think you do. Because you're the same guy. You're the same voice. You're the same person we've heard throughout history mimicking that line or variations of it, that of course we can silence our neighbors because they're just going to excite others. They're going to, what in the book is called the speech that is viewed not just as wrongful as much as dangerous, that you're going to corrupt other individuals. That's the same voice, and you're the same guy. And the fact is, it doesn't change. Many of the people today arguing for censorship are using the same terms that were used at the beginning of the Republic. But that's the conceit, right? Every generation believes that it's facing problems that no other generation had to face. Every generation thinks that they have a license that other generations don't have. But they really are saying the same thing.
Jonathan Turley, how long have you taught at George Washington? What do you teach?
I was afraid you would ask me that. Now, I've taught over 30 years. And I teach the Supreme Court course on the Supreme Court and the Constitution. I also teach torts, which deals with defamation, and I teach privacy and free speech.
What is the definition of a tort?
A tort is basically most anything that can happen to you in terms of personal injury, not just by other private individuals, but the government is recovering for injuries. It's the broadest of fields. And so it makes it a great deal of fun to teach because you get to teach a lot of these issues.
And you teach free speech as a class?
I teach it in torts because we deal with, some of those are free speech issues, with privacy torts, defamation are all free speech issues. And so we talk about it there. And I do challenge the students to try to define what free speech is before we define how we protect it.
And what are you hearing from your students about free speech?
You know, it's interesting, and I'm happy to report this, that even though, you know, the students change politically over time, when it comes to free speech, we have undersold younger people. And that's only become clear in the last few years. I just spoke at the World Forum in Berlin, Germany. And it was an incredibly anti-free speech conference. There's only two of us really from the free speech community that were speaking. And they were irate. The EU was irate over the speech that J.D. Vance had given in Munich just a few weeks earlier.
Criticizing them.
Criticizing the Europeans. But it made for some interesting moments. And one of them, I was speaking to someone from Germany, and we were disagreeing about free speech, and I was criticizing Europe for eviscerating free speech. And I said, you know, I'm glad the forum is in Berlin, because you all have been censoring free speech even before World War II, but in the most robust way after World War II. You started with the Nazis, and now you're regulating any comment that is insulting or demeaning to a group or a view, even religious people who are speaking against homosexuality. You're arresting them all. And I said, so I could finally ask a question I really wanted to ask for years. How's it going? Right? How is it going for you? Because I see all around Germany thousands of Nazis marching and skinheads. You haven't made a dent in those people, but you did make a dent in your public, because a recent poll showed that only 17% of Germans feel free to speak their mind in public. 17%. So the point that I'm trying to raise there in the book is that if you look historically, no censorship system in history has ever succeeded. Not one. It is a perfect failure rate. It has never stopped a single idea. It's never stopped a single movement. It is a total failure rate. So the question you might ask is, why do they still do it? Why is it all the rage? And the answer is because it controls a population. The problem that I say in the book is not rage rhetoric. It's state rage. It's when the state uses rage rhetoric to silence other citizens. Because the book talks a lot about rage, which is an odd thing. You know, rage is sort of all around us. On both sides, on the Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. You see it every day. We have an increase in political violence in this country. But rage is a strange thing because it gives you a license. It allows you to do things and say things you would not ordinarily do or say. And what people won't admit is that they like it. It's contagious. It's addictive, and people like it. And the real danger is when rage overcomes reason to the point that we let state rage happen. We let governments silence people that we hate. And that is the definition of an age of rage.
Jonathan Turley, you said we were born in an age of rage. This country was. Have we been without an age of rage in 250 years?
No, we have. I don't mean to paint our history as entirely dark, because I don't believe that. I still do believe the United States is the greatest hope for humanity. I have a book that's coming out for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence called Rage and the Republic, and its subtitle is The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. And what that book talks about is that American democracy is unique, but we are unique. And I think Americans often forget that yeah, we have a lot of bad periods. De Tocqueville talked about that. He talked about that Americans seem to be going every direction at one time, but they still seem to get from A to Z faster than any country on earth. We have this remarkable ability as a people to correct our wrongs. And during these ages of rage, things have happened that we have awakened. You know, when Americans saw McCarthy in the Army-Navy hearings for the first time, televised, they said no. They said that's not what we're about. So we have this redemptive ability as American citizens that we don't want to forget about. In the new book, in The Rage and the Republic, I talk about this Frenchman who came to the United States. He's a wonderful writer. And he wrote an article entitled, "What is This American?" And it's an amazingly profound article from this Frenchman. He was actually curious as to this new type of person, not any person that is made up from any particular country, coming from all over the world, different religions, different races. But he says, what is this American? And it is itself a profound question, but we often forget how unique we really are. We're a people defined by consent. We decided to join together based not on a commonality of background, but on certain values that define us. In my view, certain human rights that define us, like free speech. And so the answer is yes. For much of our history, we have redeemed ourselves.
You mentioned that in Germany, only 17% of the population feels free to speak their mind, share their views. Recently, in the last decade in the U.S., haven't we been under a little bit of an intimidation factor as well when it comes to speaking your mind, free speech?
Yes, and in fact, polls are showing that there is this chilling effect on speech. It's particularly strong on our college campuses. You know, there are two free speech movements I talk about in the modern parts of the book. And one came from Europe, and it has had a devastating effect in Europe. As I mentioned, I just met with a lot of free speech groups in Berlin, and they're all on the ropes. I mean, they are they're up against it. I mean, these are groups that are being prosecuted just for supporting people for free speech. And that wave has reached our shores. It's here now. But we also have a homegrown anti-free speech movement that originally came from higher education. It's now metastasized throughout the system. And you see that in our campuses. It's not just violent anti-free speech groups like Antifa, which is primarily an anti-free speech group. It's how it defines itself. But it's also among academics. You know, I'm a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to free speech. The fact is that when my book came out, there were 4 books that came out that criticized free speech and called for major revisions and regression from free speech. And many of these scholars believe that free speech is now dangerous and harmful to who we are. So that movement has in fact gone beyond our campuses. But here's the interesting thing. It goes back to your question about young people. And it's one of the things I asked someone in Berlin who is Irish, who was one of the Irish officials. And we had a bit of a sharp discussion. And because Ireland is one of the worst countries when it comes to free speech. And I said, I don't have to ask how things are going for you, because the Irish what happens is that whenever there is a crisis, for example, in London, there were riots, there were anti-immigration riots that were disgraceful. And they were based in part on false statements made on the internet about an individual who murdered someone, and they were false. And very quickly, many people, including myself, said those are false, that what they're saying about this person being an immigrant of this, according to these descriptions. And but what the Irish did immediately is they did what governments always do. They said, okay, it's time for a new law. They already had one of the most draconian anti-free speech laws, but they wanted to make it a crime even to have possession of material that meets these broad definitions of hate speech and in other words. It collapsed, but it collapsed because the young people in Ireland came out and said no. And it shocked the Green Party and the far left parties and the majority party in Ireland. They were all shocked that suddenly these young people said, we want free speech. And we're seeing that now in the United States as well. Younger people are showing up now at free speech conferences. They're organizing. And I'm just so happy to see it. You know, I had a debate with one of the people at Meta, and I asked him the same question of how it was going for Meta, because Meta originally ran this really creepy commercial campaign that showed young people celebrating censorship, what they call content moderation, and saying, you know, we're employing content moderation to make the internet better. And they were all so excited, and you're like, wow, is that creepy? And I asked him, you guys stopped the campaign, why? It's because I think you found out it's hard to get a free people to give up freedom. And you found out that young people actually want free speech.
But Jonathan Turley, is it my indispensable right to go online and write something slanderous about you that is untrue, but it gets traction?
It's not your right in the sense that you can do it without any type of responsibility. And that's a good example to raise, because that's defamation. And even when our country was formed, defamation, slander, libel were all known to the framers. And of course, you can do that. Now, the difference is that if you go online and say something about me that's untrue and harmful, I'm allowed to sue you. You did me harm. Yes, it was speech, but it was an act of defamation. And so often the anti-free speech community likes to say, oh, well, you know, people like Turley are wrong because there's lots of crimes committed with speech, like fraud and child or human trafficking. And it's a silly argument, because of course you use speech for these crimes, but you're prosecuting the crimes, right? And you can actually sue someone for defamation. Right? So the reason you can do that is because you're harming an individual. Your conduct is directed at a particular person or a group. So yeah, you can do that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm happy to say Meta seems to be following X, and they're reducing their censorship, and they're going back to where we were, which was not a bad place. We always did target child abuse, human trafficking, criminal acts, fraud, defamation. All of that, the free speech community had no problem with, and it worked fine. It was only in the last decade that different groups said, well, now we want to silence harmful, hateful types of language.
Could I go online and say, Jonathan Turley is X? I think that Jonathan Turley is wrong and about everything.
Absolutely. In fact, you'll find many people do. The fact is, people say a lot of things that are false. I don't sue over it, but it's sort of funny. It's some of what people say about my background or what I'm saying. But that's part of the ticket to the ball. You understand that you have a great privilege in speaking on these issues, and part of that is that people will either intentionally mislead or misrepresent what you say. But most certainly, people can say anything they want about how they view my views on free speech or any other issue. Those are protected. That's the irony, because I have written columns defending the free speech rights of people who have called for me to be fired and others to be fired in the free speech community. We actually support our anti-free speech colleagues when they get into trouble, even though they would not support us according to their same standards.
And there's that famous case, I believe, from the 70s. I've talked to Nadine Straussen of the ACLU about it, where the ACLU defended the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, Illinois. Did I get that right?
Yes, and Nadine is a wonderful civil libertarian. She's a friend of mine, but she's an inspiration for young people, I hope, today. And that was really the high point of the ACLU. I've been critical of the ACLU since then because they have adopted anti-free speech positions, in my view. They've changed. The interesting thing, the book talks about the ACLU when it was formed. And the funny thing is, the ACLU was not the free speech defender when it was created. There was another group of free speech advocates that believed free speech was a natural right, and they supported it across the boards. The ACLU actually was viewed as the moderate group that supported limitation of speech, particularly on social issues. They said it should be protected for political issues. It was the ultimate functionalist argument. And in some ways, I think they're regressing to that earlier position, because in the middle of that was the Skokie case. And that's when the ACLU inspired many of us to become free speech advocates, including myself. I watched that case, and I was overwhelmed by the power of that moment. A Jewish ACLU lawyer standing up and arguing for Nazis. It was a moment that few of us will forget. It certainly was the moment that created many of us as free speech advocates.
What about misinformation and disinformation? And first of all, what's the definition? And is that protected free speech?
Yeah. Well, there's three. There's misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation that the Biden administration said it was targeting. So these are government agencies that were saying, these are the three areas that we're targeting. We're working with academic groups and corporate groups to target. Malinformation was my favorite because according to the Biden administration, malinformation are facts that are being used in a misleading way. So they were saying that they could regulate people that were saying true things, but they felt they were using them in a way to mislead people. And you just sort of think about that for a second. What government has not argued that its critics are using true facts in a misleading way? But that's one of the three categories used to justify targeting of speech. The answer to your question is yes, they are almost all protected when you look at what they were regulating. It also shows you this slippery slope again. That is, once they went down this path, they started to ask social media companies to take out jokes and opposing scientific studies because it all was misinformation or disinformation or malinformation. And the true costs of that are now becoming apparent. I spoke at the University of Chicago a while ago, and in the front row were many of the signers of the Barrington Declaration, the Great Barrington Declaration. These were scientists that opposed dissenting views on what we should do about the pandemic. It was not just that declaration. Many of them also questioned the efficacy of those blue surgical masks, pointing out that the holes in the masks are larger than a virus, so they cannot possibly be very effective. Questioning the 6-foot rule is based on nothing. And keep in mind that 6-foot rule was the reason we shut down the businesses in the United States. We shut down this economy. They have been largely vindicated. The government has come out to say, for example, many of them were censored for the lab theory, saying that the COVID came out of a lab, and ostracized and called even racist. Now we know that federal agencies were at that time saying they thought that was the more logical explanation, the best explanation. The CDC has admitted that there wasn't a basis for the 6-foot rule, that they never had a concrete basis for that. They admitted that they didn't think those masks were particularly effective. All of those people were fired or shunned or thrown off associations. And I asked them after my speech, how many of you have been invited back? Not one of them. So these people's views were vindicated. They were shown, even if you disagree with them, to be credible enough that agencies and others now agree with them. But they're still persona non grata because they broke from the mob. And that's the true cost of censorship. We could have had a debate when the pandemic began of whether we had to shut down our schools. Our close allies in Europe didn't do that. Catholic schools didn't do that. So when you look at the performance of students in Catholic schools from that period, they are heads and shoulders above other children. They are not experiencing the emotional issues we've seen, the developmental issues we've seen. For those kids in the Catholic schools, they are off the charts in terms of their scores. The same thing can be said in Europe. So we never had that debate, and it has cost us a generation of development for our students. That's the cost of censorship.
Jonathan Turley, from your book, while we can lose our appetite for free speech, we can never truly lose our taste for it. In the end, our faith in free speech is really a faith in each other, a faith that we do not have to fear opposing viewpoints, but rather the inclination to silence others. There may be bad tendency speech, but the worst tendency is found in the effort to protect society from harmful thoughts. The book is called The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley is the author.
Thank you so much.
All Q&A programs are available on our website or as a podcast on our C-SPAN Now app.